All right. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. We can go ahead and get started. I'm Jeff Kauflin. I'm a senior editor at Forbes, where I cover fintech, and really excited to talk to everyone today about strategies for recruiting diverse perspectives into your stories. And the way this panel came about, I'm also the co-chair of a new task force within the NAHJ, the National Association for Hispanic Journalists, a new task force on business journalism, which we encourage everyone to kind of sign up for our mailing list and our LinkedIn group. But the way this came about was SABEW's education committee reached out to us and said, "Hey, would you like to collaborate on a panel on the topic?" And we said, "Absolutely, that sounds great." So we will dive in a minute, and I'll introduce our panelists in a minute. But I also wanted to give Jake Batzel a chance to introduce himself as chair of SABEW's education committee. Go ahead, Jake.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm Jake Batzel, a former journalist, now teach business journalism at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And I chair the education committee for SABEW. We love to work on practical training sessions like these. And a little toward the end of the chat, I will share my email address toward the end of the panel in the chat in case there are any journalism educators or students out there who want to get more involved with SABEW. And really excited for this dynamite panel today.
Great. Thanks, Jake. So yeah, I'd love to now turn it over to our panelists to each introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some questions. So Maria, can you start us off?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Curi. I'm a tech policy reporter at Axios. I've been a policy reporter based in Washington, D.C. for the last 6 years. I started out by covering trade policy under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. Then I moved on over to tech, and I've always, tried to prioritize including diverse sources into my storytelling. And so I'm really excited to be here today and to be having this conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa. I'm a personal finance reporter here at CNBC. And at a broad level, I write about how economic indicators and events affect people and their money. And in those articles, I offer suggestions from industry experts about what key steps everyday people can take to optimize their savings, spendings, and investments. And for about a year, I've been focusing on the cost of housing and what that means for everybody involved, from buyers, renters, and sellers.
And I'm Laura Zelenko. Thanks for having me. I'm a senior executive editor at Bloomberg News. I seem to be the only one of us sitting in a newsroom right now. So if there's any noise, apologies. I started with Bloomberg 31 years ago in Prague. I've worked overseas for quite a while for Bloomberg and run coverage around the world. My current role, I am the global head of editorial standards for Bloomberg, and I also am in charge of all of our diversity, talent, and training initiatives in the newsroom. I do a lot of work around improving our representation at every level of our workforce, as well as in our content in terms of sourcing. And one of the initiatives that I started back in 2018 is called New Voices, which I'm sure we'll talk about more on this panel. And the New Voices initiative is particularly focused on helping us improve our representation of guests on Bloomberg TV.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited for our fantastic panel. So we're going to dive in. The first question I wanted to ask is, kind of setting the stage here. Why is it important to have diverse perspectives and sources in your stories? And Laura, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. I mean, I really approach this as a standards editor. If we're trying to be fair, accurate, balanced, reduce our bias, make sure that we're telling all the stories that should be told, that need to be told, you have to have diverse perspectives. You have to be reaching out for a broader range of opinions and perspectives to decide what stories that we're telling. We looked at our data back in 2018 to see how many women specifically we were bringing on TV as experts to talk about financial markets. Our TV programming is focused largely on financial markets. And at that time in 2018, only 10% of our guests were women. And that not only didn't reflect the experts in the field, but it certainly wasn't giving us a chance to reflect the reality on the ground in terms of whose opinions we were asking about the outlook for the markets or the outlook for the economy. So if our job is to reflect reality, it is absolutely critical that our journalists are not showing a myopic, not presenting a myopic storyline, but really broadening out the lens and making sure we're bringing in perspectives. It just seems to me like it's journalism 101.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's just a basic tenet of good journalism to be able to tell the full picture. And if you're giving a one-sided story that is constantly representing just one group of people, then you're not, I think, fulfilling the mission of journalism.
Great. Teresa, any additional thoughts on that?
I agree with my fellow panelists. I mean, it's like Laura just said, it's journalism 101. In order for you to tell a concrete, full 360 story, you need all the players involved. And what better way to showcase any story than by reflecting different people who look differently in the story. And so we're not monolithic in any way. We have different cultures and backgrounds, and I think that just makes a story even stronger.
And we can find example after example of stories where big media organizations missed the story. I think Brexit's one of those examples. I think the first Trump election is another. And in my own experience, I think of this very small example, which is when I was first hired by Bloomberg. I was working in Prague back in the early 90s. And at that time, the local, we interviewed a lot of local investors about the markets. And what we found is that the local investors and the foreign investors investing in the same market had very different views. So if you were only interviewing local investors about the outlook for the market, they might be more or less optimistic. And typically the foreign investors had a very different take on it. And so, which was right, so, it was really important that we got all of those views in, and you can kind of translate that into so many different storylines.
Yeah. And I think we all probably are aware of some of the recent news around companies and how they're pulling back some of their DEI efforts. And Meta was in the news on Friday, for example, for some of that. And so, it's a very timely topic. So I wanted to ask, how does that news affect how you think about recruiting diverse sources into your stories? Maria, why don't you start us off on that?
Yeah, the Meta news was very relevant to my beat to tech policy. And I just think that we can't kind of take our foot off the gas in covering these stories just because companies are deprioritizing DEI. I think if anything, we need to be telling these stories more so today and making sure that the impact of not having diversity within these companies and diversity being prioritized in these companies is still going to be happening and taking place in the real world. And so those stories need to be told. So that I know that that's something that we're going to be following closely on my team and at Axios, is the impact of no longer having these policies around.
Yeah, and kind of following what Maria said, it just makes the whole point of this panel more important than ever. You want to, if it wasn't a priority to you before in your reporting process, it should be now more than ever.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, in terms of the work that we're doing around this, I really don't think it has any impact, because our job is to do the best possible journalism we can, and to do the best possible journalism we can, this is an absolute key tenet. And so I just and when it comes to even writing about that issue, about the pullback from DEI, I think even there you have to be so careful about making sure that there's not jargon and rhetoric and that you're not being pulled into a dialogue, into a particular narrative and that you're really diversifying your sources on that topic as well. There's a lot of different things happening at companies, and I think it can be easy to just summarize it in a very sort of short line that everyone's pushing back on DEI initiatives. And there are certain things that continue to go on, and one of those is that media companies, it's important for our stories that we are pulling in a variety of perspectives to tell the stories.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, I think we saw that also with Meta's announcement of these policies, that you had Zuckerberg really talking about how the perception of DEI is one of the reasons why they are pulling back on this. And so I think Laura's point to, that we have to really examine what this all means and what the impacts are going to be. I mean, there are very specific policies that Meta is pulling back on, but some of it is being done just because of the perception of DEI and the public discourse being so damaging. Are there other things that will still be happening to make sure that the company is, upholding diversity? So, challenging ourselves and our own assumptions, I think, is also going to be really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. So to get into some of the kind of approaches and strategies people use to find more diverse perspectives and sources in their stories, I'd love to ask, what is your overall approach to this challenge?
I mean, I can start off. I mean, I'll give the background of how we started the New Voices Initiative, which, again, I said in 2018, we realized that 10% of our external guests on Bloomberg TV were women. And I started asking the question of our bookers and of various people within the banking industry, because we interview a lot of people from the financial firms, about why this was. And it seemed like, one of the challenges that the bookers were saying is that, we really can't find women or other underrepresented executives. We just don't know where they are. Or the firms themselves are only pushing 2 people our way, and we have to take them. Or, you would talk to very senior women in the banking industry, and they would just say, I don't have the support, I don't need to do this, and I'm not getting the training. And so, I'm not gonna fight to get on TV, that kind of thing. And so we realized that one thing that we could do to sort of dislodge what was really a systemic issue was to make it easier show the bookers, yes, there are other people to interview. We're going to put them in front of you, and to the bank saying that, if you're not going to give the support, we will find a way to sponsor intensive media training for some of these executives. And we just found a way to kind of end some of these excuses that were happening and that wasn't allowing other different, very experienced, very smart, valid experts to be on TV, to be on our platforms, to understand how to get on, and for us to have more confidence that they were as good as anyone else that we were bringing on. So we started an initiative to track our representation regularly, to build a global database of diverse sources, which I can talk about, and to hire an outside firm to provide intensive media training for senior women in finance around the world, and Latinx and Black executives of all gender identities in the US. And what we've found is that all the people that have gone through that program they've all been in the industry 10 plus years, some 30 years. They're extremely experienced in their fields, and they were virtually invisible to the financial media. Many of these people had never before been on TV, and now you're seeing them. I mean, I see them on CNBC, I see them on NBC, I see them on BBC. They're just, they are experts. They deserve to have the platform, and there were just systemic reasons between how we were operating and how the banks were sort of supplying the experts that were keeping them from going on. So that's one of the things that we've done. But I think for a lot of media organizations, it's just kind of deconstructing how your journalists are finding sources and seeing if there are new and different ways. And I'm sure the reporters have better ideas than I do in terms of how to do that.
Yeah, for personal finance stories, it's always valuable to incorporate stories about how different groups or demographics are faring economically. For example, I wrote a story about the financial standing of young adults in Puerto Rico. It's a territory U.S. territory on the island. And it stemmed from a report that was published by FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority Investor Education Foundation. Reading through the report, a through line that really popped out to me was how this group of 18 to 30-something-year-olds had a higher propensity to be financially fragile compared to older counterparts or those in their 40s and 50s and above. And so after speaking with the authors of the report and learning a little bit more about their research process, I wrote down sort of a list of topics of things I wanted to discuss in the story. And then in my mind, it made sense to reach out to experts and real people on the island, or people who could speak to both firsthand experiences and the expertise that required the story. And things like that. I think the takeaway is to really think about who you need to talk to in order to make your story strong, and make the effort to reach out to economists, financial planners, industry experts from different walks of life, to get their perspective on these topics, or whatever the knowledge you need, or whatever you need to be explained for the story.
I think it's also just what stories are you choosing to tell? I think we sometimes forget the power that we have as journalists to make editorial decisions and the stories that we choose to elevate. And so we don't tell people what to think, but we do tell people what to think about. That's a really big responsibility. And so if we are chasing stories that inherently are about diverse perspectives, that's putting it front and center on all of our platforms for our audiences. So I report a lot from Capitol Hill, and usually in that environment, there are the obvious power players, the ones making the decisions. And of course, we talk to them, but we also make an effort to talk to other lawmakers that are pushing issues that are considered fringe, in part because they also don't get a lot of media attention. And so, talking to lawmakers that maybe are not as well known, but that are pushing issues that we know have a broad real world impact. Some examples of that is, for our newsletter, we started an AI and equity series. So with the support of my editor, we were able to do this in a strategic, purposeful way. We've dug into the way that AI impacts housing discrimination. We've dug into how the climate impact of AI impacts marginalized communities disproportionately. AI and surveillance, and how facial recognition impacts immigrant communities disproportionately. So we have a lot of power in what we choose to write about.
Great. Any particular tools or technology that anyone has found helpful on this? Because whether it's for tracking the diversity of sources, or just in general, thinking about who are you going to include in your list of sources you're going to go after? Any specific tools or technology that anyone has found useful?
I mean, we've leaned a lot on data to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable to doing this better. And I think that we're sort of lucky to have technology that we can tap into to help with that. In terms of, for instance, we look at our representation on television weekly, and we share that data widely within our newsroom. And we also have a database that we have used through technology that we have here that has allowed us to build out a database of 10,000 plus female experts globally in business and finance, and then lots of other ways that we can search that database by different metrics. So I think whether you have the technology or whether you have a cruder way of doing it, I do think that from my own background, this does not happen on its own. It just doesn't. I mean, you can talk and talk and talk and talk about it, and we have here for many years until you really start looking at what the reality is on what types of sources you're pulling into stories, and understanding how critical the issue is. Some reporters, like the ones that we're talking to here, are doing this naturally. It's just not that way across the board. And so I think it's really important to kind of point that out to people and to show examples of news sources that the newsroom has identified, and what kinds of stories came out by talking to them, what kind of news you've broken, really showing examples of the good journalism that's coming out. Some of what Maria was just saying is, in fact, we sort of show the world who are experts. We give them that validity, and some of the stories that we may not be telling, maybe because we're too narrow in who we're defining as experts, to help us think through what stories to tell. So you really need to show people the reality of the data, and I think also show the examples of good journalism coming out of these practices.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the other reporters on this call could probably relate to the fast-paced, sometimes overwhelming nature of having to content all the time. I write a newsletter 3 times a week, and it's usually way more than that we're sending out information because news breaks and things are happening. And there is a set of people that I just naturally tend to go to every time. Not every single time, I do reach out to others, but there's a set of experts and people, or, administration officials or people on the Hill, that I've just built a relationship with, and who I know can kind of show up for me as a source as I'm, running up against these tight deadlines. I made sure that group of people are diverse perspectives. It's not all just coming from one group, but it's people of color, it's women, it's, younger people, it's older people. I think that's a good place to start. It's a more organic way to start. I think at the company level, tracking the metrics is really important, because we got here in a systemic way where groups are underrepresented. And I think the only way to get out of it is in a systemic way where there are metrics and evidence that these bigger, news organizations and companies can point to. But at the individual level, when I go out and network and meet people and build my source list, I am intentional about making sure that they're coming from different backgrounds.
And following Maria's point there, and if you aren't starting off from that point, I would want you to give yourself a little bit of grace, because as she described, journalists are upheld to tight deadlines. We are running against the clock often to produce these stories, and make sure they're 200% ready. And so if that process of diversifying your Rolodex or your source list looks a little slower, don't worry. As long as you talk to at least one other person that looks different from the rest of your source list, I think that's a good step forward to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's great. And Laura, in terms of, it sounds like, you guys have built out a lot of kind of infrastructure around this. How do you, though, get people to use the database and to track, obviously you can provide the tools and set up the tools and talk to people about the importance, but also there's the very important follow-up, of course, of getting people to use the database and track their sources. What in your experience has been helpful in doing that, getting people to kind of really stay with these practices?
I think one thing that's been really helpful is to show progress. I mean, since 2018, we've almost quadrupled our representation of female guests on Bloomberg TV. So we ended last year at 38%. I think anyone watching, including all of our staff, knows that the conversations are different now, that we're, and that we can show interview after interview that we weren't doing before, people that had never before been on, and people are kind of like, how is that possible? This person has been in the business 25 years. They're an expert. They manage billions and billions of dollars. They have a very successful track record, and we just didn't work hard enough to find them, And so I think showing those examples is really helpful. And I think that, and we spend a lot of time going over stories that did better, or won awards or whatnot, because the reporter was so proactive in finding different sources and being more representative in their coverage. I can think of a story we did out of London on the impact on Black homeowners of rising interest rates. And it was a story that was done in that case by a Black reporter in London who had built out an incredible network of sources. And the story was so fantastic, and it won all these awards in the UK. And like we wouldn't have done that story in the past. It was just sort of a good example of like that story was just sitting there and we didn't even see it. And so we try to give those examples. On the database, I would say, and I think Maria and Anna can talk to this more, but obviously reporters tend to hold their sources very close to each other, and they don't necessarily want to, depend on a database that's joint, that's somehow shared, a shared workspace. I would argue that for some of the reasons that Maria is saying is that because we're on deadline so often, it is a good tool for a newsroom to have so that you don't have that excuse. If you have a whole list of diverse economists, for instance, and you're on deadline reporting on new jobs numbers, at least it'll be at your fingertips if you need that. And so I do think that there's value in doing that. And there are lists all over the place that you can kind of incorporate into your newsroom. But I do think that, I think that to some extent, helping one another in identifying those people and making it possible to access jointly is a positive thing. It doesn't have to be your off-record sources that you don't want anyone to know about. But I think there's enough people that we're quoting that does make sense to share that. And again, we just use example after example, and we keep trying to make the tool easier to use. And some people get it, and at some point maybe other technology will make it easier to access. I don't know.
Great. In terms of, I know, some people talk about, at least in recruiting, the idea of setting targets for how many people you're adding into kind of the top of the pipeline. There's a Rooney rule, I think it's called, where, you interview a certain amount of diverse candidates. You need to hit that threshold. So, I know people talk about setting targets for your sources and, how many folks from diverse backgrounds do you have in your source list? I want to just ask about that. What are the kind of pros and cons of setting targets in your source list for a set of people from, a certain percentage of people from diverse backgrounds? And, do you do that or not? And what are the pros and cons of that, would you say?
I can start.
Sure.
I'm not doing that so prescriptively in my own reporting. I see the value in a company having that type of data and those metrics, and I see the value in tying that to incentives. Like Laura was talking previously about giving awards out to people who are telling these stories. And it's not simply because you're checking the box and you've quoted, 5 people of color. It's because you have told a better story, a more informative story at the end of the day by getting a diverse set of viewpoints. And so I see the metrics being useful at the company level. If you make it part of performance reviews and you say, can you show me holistically efforts to tell these different stories? Like maybe it could be less prescriptive in that way. So I could see the benefits in that. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think one of the cons, just like Maria, as you said, you don't want to fall into the trap of doing this in order to just check a box. People aren't boxes. So just keep that in mind. I think it's good to have targets, metrics. It's good to have set goals, because at the end of the day, that's how you get things done. That's how your January resolutions actually materialize throughout the year. You set yourself tangible targets. But I would just underscore that differentiating that, you're not checking boxes is the goal. Your goal is to make your story stronger, more holistic?
Yeah, I think that there's a real balance to have there. I don't think you're going to get the buy-in if people feel like it's a check the box exercise. And at the same time, if you don't set aspirational targets, people do, you kind of want to be able to like I said, once you can show people that you're making progress, that it really wasn't where we wanted to be, and now it's we're doing better. Otherwise, you really won't change. I mean, I think a lot of media organizations have been talking about this for decades, and we're still talking about it. Yeah. So, where are all of your media? Where are all of your organizations on this? I mean, can you actually say that you're in a better place? And I think if you don't have some of that data, it's hard to reflect that. But ultimately, I totally agree. You're not going to get the buy-in if it's seen as a check the box exercise. And we do a workshop that really has journalists, managers look at sort of having them understand their responsibilities in terms of building a more diverse workforce at every level, retaining that workforce, and having more inclusive content come out of all of these efforts that include diverse sourcing, and talk about it more holistically. Like Anna said, where are the examples where that's paid off for better stories, and where do you think you could have done better? Where did you, assign, where could you have assigned 2 reporters on a story and gotten a much broader network of sourcing for that one story than if you had just had that one person? And if you had paired up people from 2 different backgrounds, could you have gotten, different, inputs in terms of how you write that story? And I think I gave this example before, but just to explain the power of this and the impact it can have. I can remember a story once where we were writing about the wealth management industry, and the photo team went to, they wanted to know what experts the reporters were going to interview. And the reporters knew right away these 2 men that they were going to interview. And so sort of gave them those names, and the photo team went out to take the pictures. In the end, the story had other sources, had women and other representation in the story, but because those were the first 2 people that they for sure knew that they were going to talk to, that those became the photos that were attached to the story on social media. And it ended up it basically, between those 2 photos and the teams that they showed, it looked like the industry was basically all white men. And even the story didn't reflect that, but that's what the story looked like on social media. And I remember getting some responses about, kind of that wasn't really a reflection of the wealth management industry, which, by the way, is, getting, there's a lot more women running these divisions these days. So, I mean, it just wasn't even the right reflection. So, I mean, it can have an impact downstream. And you want to give people those examples so that they know it's not just checking a box.
And I think, yeah, we all know there are challenges, and we've talked about this a little bit. You're on a deadline, you have a quick turnaround, and trying to find diverse sources for all your stories. What are the biggest challenges that you see and that you've faced, and how have you dealt with them?
So sometimes it's that in the organization itself that you are trying to report on, there's a lack of diversity, or the people that are available to speak or empowered to speak don't necessarily represent diverse viewpoints. In those instances, I ask those people, if it's a white male, executive, ask the question that has to do with diversity, and ask a follow-up question, and ask it in the beginning of the interview and not at the end of the interview as an afterthought when you have 2 minutes left with him. So in those interviews, when you're not talking to the diverse sources themselves, still elevate the storylines that we know matter.
And sometimes when you're trying to source out real people for your stories, and if the story lends itself, or you're looking out or reaching out to people who are diverse from different cultures and backgrounds, and you found this real person and they have a compelling story, and you want to add their story into the lead, or make their story the story that you're working on. Sometimes it's hard to overcome their hesitance to be on the record. That can be a very challenging conversation. And then I would suggest to really lean on your peers or your editors or your support group to navigate those kinds of challenges.
So as a quick follow-up to that, I think the trust aspect is very real. Some of these communities, I remember reporting on broadband deployment in Native American communities. Some of these groups don't have great experience with whether it's the government or the media itself. And so building that trust so that you can get an authentic view from them is a challenge, but that's something that you overcome with time and relationship building skills.
Any specific tips on that? How do you build that trust?
I think unlike when you're talking to some of, these DC insiders that are very used to speaking with people from the media, explaining that, this can be an off the record conversation just to start. It means that nothing you say to me is going to end up being publicized or published. And so, let's just get to know each other at first, having an intermediary. So, we did this through NTIA, actually, when I was at Bloomberg Government, and there were people already at NTIA, which is a part of the Commerce Department, that had already had community liaisons building trust. And so having them introduce me was also helpful. And then just going in with humility. I mean, you kind of are coming in from the, New York, DC to these other communities, and they've been burnt in the past. So just being sensitive to that and patient in telling their stories.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, I guess it depends what kind of story we're talking about, but I think really making the case that the story is incomplete without their views represented, I think is really important. I think we've also, I think that point about intermediaries is super important when you face some pushback from journalists saying, I just don't know where to find this person, or this community. I don't have my own connection in this community. So stories about transgender rights, for instance, will sometimes go to GLAAD, the organization GLAAD, and they'll set us up with some experts from the community if you don't know, the journalist doesn't know themselves. So I mean, it's just important to make that effort. I think where we really fail ourselves is where we just kind of, I mean, it's again not good journalism, but just throw up your hands and say, I don't have the time, or I don't know where to find that representation, and so I'm not going to do everything I can to make sure that viewpoint is reflected.
Great. I think that's a great stopping point for us to open up to questions from the audience. If anyone has questions, we'd love to hear from you so we can make this panel as useful as possible. So feel free to come off mute, turn on your camera if you're open to it, and ask questions, because we'd love to hear from you and make this as useful as possible. And you can put them in the chat too, or the Q&A if that's if you prefer to do that, and we'll be monitoring that as well. Well, while we wait for those, actually, let me ask another question, which is, we talked about this a little bit, topics that kind of lend themselves to recruiting sources with diverse perspectives. And Maria, you talked about this a little bit, and Teresa too, but any other topics in your experience lend themselves to this well that, I don't know, you might not have thought of otherwise? Yeah, what comes to mind, or examples of questions you ask folks? Like Maria, you said you'll ask someone a diversity question who's white male executive, for example. What comes to mind there?
In terms of what specific questions I would ask someone like that, I mean, just what
Yeah.
policies do you have in place in your organization to, account for the issues that come from underrepresentation? Do you also think that there is a problem in perception right now? Should companies be reactionary to that? Should policies change? I mean, now I'm thinking of questions that are pertinent to this moment. Should companies change their policies depending on which administration is in power? How might this impact your employees? Are you facing internal turmoil because of employee backlash? Or just some of the questions that I would ask. In terms of topics, we also covered prison phones, the ways in which some of these companies charge really high prices to people in prisons and in jails across the country, and the way that the Federal Communications Commission worked to lower those costs. There are a lot of different business stories that have these angles, and I think if our purpose is to help people, we should uncover them. But I'm seeing we have questions in the chat too.
Yeah, one that has come up is, what are your tips for finding quote real people, so not experts, to talk to, the kind of whether that's consumer. I'd take the question to be whether that's consumers or everyday people that are affected by these things. What are your best tips for finding those types of people for your stories?
I've found it very effective to reach out to organizations. There are associations, nonprofit groups of different cultures and backgrounds under the sun. And so I've found that reaching out to those groups is very helpful. Depending on what you're working on, certain experts, like if you're working on a housing story, for example, you can reach out to real estate agents, and through real estate agents, you can see what buyer, seller would be willing to talk to you. Financial planners are also a great repository. Like, reach out to them if you're working on a financial planning or a personal finance story, and if in the conversation comes up any situations that are happening with their own clients or things that they're advising their clients, and sneak in that question, like, would you mind connecting me with this person? I found that those streams of sourcing can be very helpful, or even talking to experts of different different focuses. Like, if they know of somebody else who could talk about this, or if they know a small company that's working on this situation, I'd reach out to those groups.
Yeah, I would guess also just getting yourself into different communities. I mean, if you're doing a story on immigration, like, go down to border counties, or if you're writing about the drag scene in LA, like, go visit the drag bars. I mean, it's just kind of basic reporting too. You have to put yourself into the community, which kind of gets back to the issue that I see here about building diverse newsrooms. I mean, it's the better representation that you have in your newsroom, the kind of that's also a resource, is just tapping into the diversity of your own newsroom to reach out to different communities.
Okay. Then how about tips for promoting readership of diverse stories? Anyone, any thoughts on that? On how do you promote readership of stories that really focus on whether it's folks from diverse perspectives or a topic related to diversity?
I love this question. I think that as reporters, some of us are great on social media. Some of us don't love to tweet our stories out every time, or just not that good at it. I think this question is really for leadership and people that are in charge of sending those push notifications and those alerts. There's an editorial decision being made there in terms of, this is the story that is going to hit everyone's inbox from Axios first thing in the morning, or from Bloomberg, or from wherever. Leaders really have to also prioritize these stories and push them out on the platforms, put them on the front page, make them as important as some of the other things that, we traditionally elevate.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to representation within the newsroom at every level as well, because if you only have, if your representation gets more and more homogenous as you get up the level, the decision-making levels, you may have reporters coming up with fantastic ideas and pursuing great stories, and then someone who's making a decision above them just doesn't see the value and isn't giving it, that kind of support. So I think it's really, really important for that reason as well. I would also say that it's not just about getting readership for diverse stories, but also the fact that you can really, I think, broaden out your audience by bringing more voices into your stories. And one example I would give, we just did a big conference last year in London called Women, Money, and Power. And it was a very serious finance conference with all female programming. And the readership of those stories was phenomenal. We took it seriously and the audience took it seriously. And it's like they were, it was, I think it just sort of said to me is that it's not that we're not pushing it out as a diverse story, we're pushing it out as important content. And it just so happens that when you read it, you're going to get a lot of voices from women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds around the world, and so I think that it's that's something that's probably not our jobs necessarily as the journalists trying to figure out that equation, but the audience point here is huge. It's a huge opportunity.
Another question: how can we better advocate for better newsroom diversity? I know, we don't our panel here. We don't have recruiters on our panel, but what does anything come to mind in advocating for newsroom diversity?
I mean, we do a lot of work as I said, talking to managers about their responsibility in the recruiting process, to really think through their teams and what's missing on their teams. They may have, pretty good gender balance, but they may be missing a lot of different other perspectives in their team, and to really think about that as they go out and pipeline for candidates and make sure that they're not just hiring the first person that, that they meet, or that this one person that they've had their eye on for years and years, but never really thought about who else is out there to cover that beat, and just trying to teach people a little bit about their own biases, and to think about what kind of hire can make their team stronger collectively. I think it's an important thing to talk about in the recruiting process, and we work very closely with our recruiters on that, so that there's a conversation early on about the team and about what kind of skills and also what kind of background would be helpful to enhancing the team collectively, and then that feeds into the efforts to pipeline candidates.
And for one thing from Forbes I'll mention is we do, Allie Jackson-Jolly, my colleague at Forbes, does a lot of work on this, and we've made great progress on different things. And I'm not in touch with the many different ways Allie has done this, but one is in HBCU Scholars Program, where one of our kind of recruiting channels is just HBCUs. But that's just kind of like one small piece, I think, of our overall strategy. But I thought I'd mention that as something that we has been really successful for us. Let's see. So going through another great question here. How do you navigate reporting in circumstances where prominent people in the industry seem hostile to the topic? It's a great question. Thinking about tech VC, where there's been kind of a backlash, which is, I feel like, very public on Twitter too. You have some very loud voices, and so how do you navigate reporting in these circumstances? Maria, you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I think with as much professionalism as possible. I think also having a newsroom that's in your corner, backing you and making your safety the number one priority and ensuring that you know that is also really helpful. But yeah, we're entering a time where journalism in general is could feel like it's under attack from people who are in positions of power. And so it's a very real concern. I don't know if I have a perfect answer for that, but I think that having a newsroom that's in your corner is helpful and can boost your confidence going into these situations, and just knowing, you know, basic safety protocols, how to handle yourself, the legal implications of some of these conversations that you might be having. But hopefully it doesn't deter any of us from asking the questions anyway, because they are important questions to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously there are, you know, I mean, newsrooms may have different standards or rules around this, but just in terms of, I mean, you can get people to speak off the record, or you can find ways to protect their identity if that's the issue. If that's the question we're talking about, right? In terms of getting sources to feel confident in talking to you.
I think it's more around you know, addressing it with people who are kind of anti-DEI in a way, you know, like, you know, they're kind of addressing that. Yeah, I think it's, which Laura, maybe you've kind of, you know, you've probably seen with perhaps over the years in finance, folks who kind of reject the importance of this, or I don't know. What has been your experience?
I mean, I was going to say to Maria when we were talking about the questions to ask people now, I mean, you know, 5 years ago, these were the same people saying this is really important to our business. It's going to help us be more innovative and be smarter and all of this. And, you know, has that changed? You know, it's like, or to what extent has that changed? Do you regret saying that now? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you know, I think it's just like any question that you're asking a business executive about their businesses, you know, I mean, I think all of us have had pushback on any number of things that we've asked over the years. People are hostile to us. I mean, I think you just ask the question and have your facts to back up what you're saying, and, you know your topic, and, you know, push as hard as you can, and then move on. But I don't think it's any different than any topic that you're going to ask about their profitability or about their hiring or their, you know, impending layoffs or anything like that. That can be also very tricky to ask.
We'll say just one concern or thing that's on my mind that's maybe different now from the past is, in the past you asked these questions, but these people in positions of power would still come back to journalists because we kind of have control over the information ecosystem, and so they want to come back and talk to us. But we are kind of in a different moment now where they could get just as much, they can get their messaging out there, you know, just as well, and without really any fact checking through podcasters or social media. And so in navigating these circumstances, how do you make sure you don't end up, you know, icing them out to where they don't want to talk to you anymore? I mean, there are ways to hold people accountable. There are other ways to hold people accountable, not necessarily just by having face-to-face time with them or a direct line of communication, of course, but that's something that's on my mind, is, you know, their ability now to just go to different platforms and not talk to you at all.
Another question, we have two more, which I think we can cover in the next 5 minutes. My newsroom has some source tracking to better diversify sources. It's been successful in my department, but other departments have pushed back against the exercise. What tips do you have for getting buy-in from colleagues? We've addressed this a little, but I would love to hear more. Laura, what do you think, since you have a lot of experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a real evolution. And I think, again, if we're talking about other departments being news departments, I think that that the journalism itself will help make that argument. And I think also getting more, I would, two other things I would say, getting very strong support from very senior managers. I mean, in our case, our chairman is a huge, huge advocate of all of this work. That helps a lot. So is our editor-in-chief, obviously. Just building, just having like champions around the newsroom. I mean, ultimately, this work has to be done by the people doing the reporting. You know, but if you have more people sort of saying this is what quality journalism requires, and that you have the people in charge saying that, you know, this is an expectation, like any other expectation we have. We want to break news, and we want to make sure that we have a diversity of sources. You know, that those two things are kind of said together. I think that helps as well. And I'm also, just to say, if there's someone on this call that wants to have a further conversation about any of this, I'm always happy to have a conversation.
Great. Last question. How can we support sources who aren't always familiar with reporting processes and also vulnerable, such as undocumented sources and asylum seekers? Can we support them to feel confident about sharing their stories without overstepping as journalists into the realm of giving them advice?
I think that's a very important question to ask in all of this. I think Maria had said something about this earlier, but just approaching this conversation with as much humility as possible and being super aware of who you're talking to. I think it's always helpful to really explain to the person what your role is and what you do and how to navigate interviews. Like, let them know what on the record means, be honest about what off the record means, let them know what on background means. And while you're having that conversation with them and as you're attentively listening to them, I've learned that it's always helpful to circle back on something and ask them if they're comfortable with this being published. Is there a different way you would feel comfortable with this being on the record? Like, always having that sincere conversation with this person, especially if they're not used to talking to the media, I think is very important to keep in mind. As well as leaning on your editors during the process. And once you have all your information gathered, what can be off the record and what can be on the record. Yeah, I think that's what's really important.
Great. Fantastic. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to our great panelists here and SABEW for help putting this together and everyone who joined. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful for everyone. We're going to put this on our YouTube page, our NAHJ Business Journalism Taskforce YouTube page, and I think Jake, if I'm not mistaken, it'll be on your page for a period of time. Jake, go ahead and chime in on that.
Yeah, I think once the link is ready, we will also circulate and share within SABEW as well.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much again, everyone. Really appreciate it and hope to speak with you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.